So I'm here this evening. My name's Gena Wirth. I'm design principal at SCAPE. I'm here this evening to kind of talk about adaptive, dynamic, changing landscapes within our office, SCAPE's office specifically. I also added a little bit extra to the title here about designing with sediment because, as Jane mentioned, it's something I'm very passionate about, and I think it really relates very directly to the thread of these projects, and it's probably something that I think in the traditional design context, we don't think quite enough about. So hopefully this helps kind of push some buttons tonight. So I'll be kind of presenting through these like two hats and two lenses, though they're really quite related, through the lens of the work of SCAPE Landscape Architecture. We are a professional landscape architecture and urban design, or landscape-focused urban design practice. We are about 90 people, 85, 90 people right now, and we're located in New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. And also as a kind of side project or volunteer activity, for many years, like over a decade now, I've been working with a really lovely group of collaborators within this nonprofit organization called the Dredge Research Collaborative. And we're kind of 6 to 8 people, depending upon how you kind of count to the group. And both of these organizations have websites, and I would definitely recommend you kind of check out the work of the DRC and SCAPE as well, because there's a lot more kind of depth and richness of content that I could possibly share today. So tonight, adaptive landscapes and scaling design. Just a little bit of an introduction to SCAPE. As Jane mentioned, we are truly a collaborative practice. It's very important that the work kind of reflects the many, many people that contribute to the work, both within the office and also the greater stakeholders and public engaging within the work. So we have a very dynamic team. We're located across these 3 geographies, but they're all united by having a very strong, very urban relationship with water. Distinct, unique water bodies like the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, and the New York Harbor. Also within SCAPE, I think something that's really important to our practice is that we tend to kind of hire, not exclusively, but it's always a bonus to kind of think about people that bring interdisciplinary skill sets to the practice, because so much of our work crosses boundaries of engineering, of horticulture, of architecture, of planning, of urban design. So we like to think about people who have a core discipline or core area of study, but maybe have also explored or done dual degrees or kind of explore other ways of kind of shaping and framing the physical world. So lots of interdisciplinary people within our office. And I was mentioning this a little bit earlier in discussion this afternoon. We are a very US-based practice. We have a lot of pride in kind of trying to work and focus in areas that are really close to home for us. This is a sense of like responsibility to our projects and the communities in which we live. We do travel all across the country and have projects in many locations, but you can see these emerging clusters in the Southeast, around the New York metro area, and recently in the Bay Area. So being able to like occupy our projects and run into stakeholders on the street is a really important thing for us. Equally important is the big ideas that we're trying to tackle in our practice. And in many ways, these are like paralyzing, terrifying kind of challenges that we as humanity face in the future and face every day. Climate change, the many issues and impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, which is I think, equally relevant crisis, but maybe less publicized or less well understood, and challenges of social inequity, which I think we all see in the fabric of our everyday lives. And the kind of format or template in which we're trying to kind of solve or improve some of these big challenges are dynamic landscapes, urban ecological systems, and community engagement processes. We're trying to tie all of these factors together in our physical work. And so at SCAPE, we really practice across a very, very wide range of scales, and that allows us to kind of explore and test these ideas, whether we're talking about the scale of a pocket park and how that could help with like urban heat island, or think about providing a critical habitat to a niche insect species, or we're thinking about like the scale of the southern portion of Louisiana. So we did a big project with the Coastal Restoration and Protection Authority, the CPRA, which was about how to kind of adapt and think about like large-scale dynamic landscape change in this region. And we also work on what I would call like more typical, conventional, like really beautiful really wonderful landscape architectural work. So I don't have time this evening to kind of get into detail about some of these like larger built work projects that our office has been kind of recently advancing, but they also kind of pick up and build on some of these threads of research. So particularly the kind of social engagement kind of thread of our and big picture idea of our practice is very embedded in this project here. This is Tom Lee Park in Memphis. That's really about creating a very welcoming place that really serves the people of Memphis. Its attitude and spirit is the spirit of meet me at the river, of a place of welcoming, connecting, and joining together along a revitalized waterfront. We also do kind of larger scale, more urban projects. So this is a 2.5 mile project in Lexington, Kentucky. It's called Town Branch Commons, and it's a pedestrian and bicycle kind of thread of Kentucky bluegrass that like winds its way through a highly urban downtown. So expressing these goals of urban ecology in a pretty conventional, like traffic planning and pedestrian, like bike ped, a safety project. And we also work on kind of destination, highly urban waterfront parks, more of which I'll show this evening. This is our recently constructed project in San Francisco called China Basin Park, which is shaped to be a kind of resilient park design that's resilient to future flooding, but also kind of creates unique magnetic relationships with the Giant Stadium across the canal. And so that was a quick overview of SCAPE, but to talk really briefly about the Dredge Research Collaborative. We are not a professional practice. The Dredge Research Collaborative is a collection of different academics and practitioners that are all exploring different projects and modes of research around sediment-based landscapes. And most landscapes are sediment-based landscapes, so the scope can be very broad, but we've really focused on riverine and coastal landscapes and the sediment dynamics embedded within those systems. We've also really been generous to have the generous support of many Dredge Research Collaborative intern collaborators contribute to the work. So an expansive team. And one of the kind of core concepts behind this nonprofit organization is that sediment is an essential piece of the urban ecosystem, but often an underthought piece and often kind of burdened with like unseen consequences of how we shape and manage riverways, water bodies and waterways. This is a diagram that we made to kind of help organize some of our work that kind of show, we call this the dredge cycle. It kind of shows the different processes and the different ways that humans impact and modify sedimentary systems, like the system of how a grain of silt might wash off a hillside in an upper watershed or sediment shed region, flow down a river or road down a river, and end up in a coastal estuary and build a marsh. And how at many points along that chain, those actions can be changed or modified, leading to a dramatic change in the downstream landscapes or the local landscapes where the action is occurring. And I got interested in this work, just as like a more personal note, because I was really interested in finding ways to kind of deepen the research. The SCAPE is a very research-focused office, but we're also a professional practice. And we have clients and we have deadlines and we have RFPs to respond to. And it was useful for me to have like a personal outlet where I felt like I could explore and research some of these topics and threads around systems of water and geology and visual representation and storytelling in a kind of way that didn't have to meet the schedule of a client or a professional practice that's also trying to be a financially stable entity. So this has been a very useful kind of like corollary or kind of complement to the professional work that we've been doing at SCAPE. And so the Dredge Research Collaborative does many things. Some of them were events. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the lecture. But just as an example of some of the kind of in situ research that we've been doing, this is a very old slide. This is like before everyone had drones. So this is a balloon mapping activity that we did where you actually attach a camera to a kite. We also did balloons as well. So it was like DIY aerial photography before drones existed. But it was a method of kind of studying and looking at a larger scale sediment-based ecosystem that was being built in the middle of New York City, a marsh island restoration project in Jamaica Bay, where the core material for that sediment, for the core material of that restoration, the new sand and sediment for the marsh island, was dredged from the shipping channels of New York Harbor. So that material was extracted from the harbor and brought here and helped kind of restore marshlands to this degraded ecosystem. So this has been one of our precedents that the DRC has studied as like an example of how we can do it better with sediment systems. So if you're interested in this work, I would definitely recommend checking out Silt Sand Slurry. A lot of that kind of research and kind of stories about America's four coasts are located in that book. And hopefully it's either will be or is in your library. But I thought tonight I could talk about 3 SCAPE projects and a little bit of the DRC work as an overlay that really deal with both these issues of climate adaptation, dynamic and adaptive landscapes, and designing with sediment. Each project kind of featuring each theme to a different degree. So I'll start with work that I'm calling the Gowanus Lowlands. This is a project that started as a community-driven master plan and has now resulted in a large number of built work projects that are at various stages of construction and planning. If anyone's familiar with the neighborhood of Gowanus in Brooklyn, New York, it's a highly urban neighborhood today. But historically, and it's named after the Gowanus Canal, which is a big canal that pulls into the city. Historically, this canal was a tidal creek and inlet. You can see it here in this image. It's a very meandering, very wild, lots of like undulating edges and small nooks and crannies and crevices, mill ponds, oyster reefs, low salt marsh, high salt marsh, like a whole tidal mosaic of ecosystems happening within this low-lying area between these 2 high points within Brooklyn itself. It became an industrialized canal like in the mid-1800s, like 1850, 1860. And so that tidal creek was hardened and straightened and became a place of like great industrial exchange, lots of shipping material from the Erie Canal that was shipped down to New York City to build New York City's like fabric of brownstone homes, all was like transported through the Gowanus Canal. So there were wood storage facilities, there were stone yards, lumber yards, just all kinds of material exchange was happening. But there's also very heavy industry being built along the banks of the Gowanus, like the manufactured gas plants that you see in the distance, which have left a really intense toxic legacy of coal tar, heavy metals, you name it. It's been kind of contaminating the Gowanus Canal for over 100 years. And this is what it looked like about a decade ago. This is one of the, if you were a city planner, you would probably call this an underdeveloped neighborhood. It was a very industrial neighborhood with many vacant parcels, a lot of parcels being used for like bus storage, very privatized and not nearly as built up and developed as the greater areas of New York City. It also became a really important kind of place for the Brooklyn creative community, lots of artists and makers and like light industrial craftspeople kind of located in this neighborhood. And the Gowanus definitely had a certain kind of like unique urban industrial charm that attract landscape architects and designers and other kind of professionals to this area to kind of reimagine what its future might be. From an ecological perspective, the water is quite contaminated and the sediment below it's extremely contaminated, and the edges of the canal are all very high and hardened with bulkheads and strong edges. So kind of completely lacking that like tidal ecosystem that it had previously. And so SCAPE, it's maybe a little bit longer story, is that like as I mentioned, many designers were drawn to this area, and I actually met many of my colleagues at SCAPE volunteering with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy when I first moved to New York. So it was kind of just a fun experimental place where people were like, repairing street tree pits and trying to improve tree health and trying to get like more involved in building urban ecology stewards for this neighborhood. And one of the main organizations kind of leading that charge was the Gowanus Canal Conservancy. So if you think about like big parks in big cities, like for example, in New York, we have Central Park and there's a Central Park Conservancy. It's like a privately run nonprofit group that helps with park maintenance and park programming and park advocacy. The Gowanus Canal doesn't have that large park, but there's a stewardship organization for the greater neighborhood, which is a really unique and special thing that's advocating for more park space, more green space to be built along the Gowanus. And so they commissioned SCAPE to kind of help them develop what was ultimately named the Gowanus Lowlands Master Plan for this area, which was meant to be a community-led vision for open space stewardship of the canal, the kind of network of parks and open spaces that were within the canal and its watershed. So as part of that process, this like visioning process, we developed a lot of different kind of graphics and images describing like the history of the neighborhood, both the social history and the ecological history. So this is that image showing that overlay of the tidal creeks and wetlands with the hard edges of today's Gowanus overlaid. So you can just see the kind of juxtaposition of those two different kind of physical forms. And then also some of the challenges that historic legacy of salt marsh kind of presents today in the neighborhood. The neighborhood is very low-lying. It has higher neighborhoods of Carroll, like physically higher, more elevated neighborhoods of Carroll Gardens and Park Slope on either side of it. It's kind of a low point in between. It flooded to this like great extent during Hurricane Sandy, and also has very typical like sunny day flooding issues with high tide flooding and precipitation driven flooding. So one thing we do at SCAPE a lot is think about, it's not just flooding. It's like, what kind of flooding is it? What type of water is coming in? Is it coastal water? Is it sewage backup water? Is it rain that is like impounded and can't move through a drainage system? Here in the Gowanus, they have all of the above. So like many myriad of flood conditions intersecting here. And then the other really interesting thing about this neighborhood that I think really motivated the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to develop this master plan and develop this like framework or new vision for the future is that the canal was poised to change extremely dramatically through a number of large-scale urban investments. One of those investments was the canal was designated a Superfund site, which is a U.S. like EPA designation, Environmental Protection Agency. It's a designation for sites that are so contaminated, the federal government has to get involved and help assist with the long-term cleanup of that site. And in a way, that was a real win for the Gowanus because it meant federal funding was coming and a timeline would happen for cleaning up the canal. And ultimately, the plan for that is dredging out the sediment, the contaminated sediment of the canal, and exporting it off the site. That's the federal government's plan, and that is in action right now. But it does mean a kind of dramatic transformation of the ecological health of the water and the quality of the water over time. So that was one change that was coming. Another change that was coming is this canal itself is very much not just contaminated by industrial contaminants, it's also contaminated by like nutrient and other sewage contaminants that come in when we have a combined sewer overflow event. So New York City's sewage infrastructure, when a large rate of it, it's like combined with its stormwater infrastructure. I don't know if anyone here in the room knows about CSOs or if that's a challenge here. I would assume it's a challenge in parts of Toronto. But when we have a large rain event, stormwater and sewage end up in the same pipe, and those pipes reach capacity, and the wastewater treatment plants cannot handle the capacity of the water that's coming in, and they overflow into local water bodies. So when we have a large rain, a large precipitation event, at many different points, all those little pink dots on the map, sewage mixed with rainwater is dumping into the canal. And so another big change that was on the horizon was a consent decree order that basically ordered the city to address this problem and build large-scale storage tanks to store that combined sewer overflow before it entered the canal. So another big positive ecological change in the long term is coming to this area. And then finally, because that's not enough and it's New York City, so we have to do all of the things at once, there was a concept about rezoning this whole area. New York City has a massive affordable housing crisis right now. It's extremely difficult to live and work in the city if you make a median income. And the kind of New York City Planning Department, as well as the mayor's administration at that moment in time, was very motivated to rezone the canal. And so over a 15-year period, a community process happened to help structure a rezoning. So The canal was going to be cleaned up in different ways, both with the CSO issue and the sediment contamination, and a whole bunch of new, very tall buildings were being built along its banks, and a lot of planning and investment was going to happen in the canal. And so I think the GCC saw all of this change coming down the pipeline, and instead of trying to fight that change, I think they really felt like it was more important to try and advocate for what kind of positive change the community would want to see as part of, for example, a community benefits agreement that might be attached to the rezoning and advance along with the plan. So they decided to kind of work with SCAPE to help develop both a advocacy strategy where the plan could be used as a tool to talk to landowners, to talk to city officials. Most of the canal was privately owned, so it was very important that many people were on board with this vision. Otherwise, nothing would get implemented. And so the Conservancy did a huge amount of outreach, kind of talking to different people about what types of open spaces they would like to see, what types of water management issues needed to be addressed. And we worked together to kind of set up these 4 really important benchmarks for the canal and for the vision: a cleaner urban ecosystem, a community connector, a network of parks, and a wild urban waterway. And then this is our bird's eye image of what this canal might look like in the future when there truly was a network of public spaces built along the canal, and kind of stronger connections with existing spaces and street grids helping manage stormwater, and kind of all working together to create a more vibrant urban ecological system. And so again, this is a very complicated process because it involves many different types of agencies within New York, not just one agency making all the decisions, but many agencies often having very different opinions about what should happen, for example, at street ends where streets hit the canal, and also private landowners controlling many of those spaces. And so these are images of the canal prior to rezoning, and then some of the city's kind of visualizations of what some of these new buildings and new architecture might look like along the canal from a massing and zoning perspective. But the question of what should the open space look like really became part of the planning process that we helped the Conservancy advocate for. One of the interesting things about zoning within New York, and this is something we deal with a lot, is landscape architects. How does your design comply with a specific regulation? It sounds really boring, but it's it's a huge piece of our work, especially on waterfront sites, because in New York, if you build a new building on a waterfront site, you have to build a 40-foot wide public open space to accompany that. So that was the assumption with the development of the framework plan with the Conservancy, to think about this network of parks and public spaces. How could they have programs that really respond to community desires? How could they have more living spaces embedded within them? Because the way the zoning was written previously kind of led to some more generic public spaces being created. How could the public space really capture the energy of the Gowanus and also implement some of these kind of water and resilience modifications that the neighborhood so desperately needed? So one thing I'll focus on this evening was this question of the bulkhead, and this relates a little bit to the contamination and the dredging. I think when we started this project, there was a vision that the Gowanus Canal could have soft edges again. It could have tidal wetlands and all of these unique historical ecological dynamics happening within this space. But the more research we did and the more we learned about the cleanup process was that for the Superfund and cleanup of the canal, there's a lot of contaminated sediment in the canal. And there's also a lot of contaminated sediment in the adjacent parcels that are being individually redeveloped. And the cleanup process was only dealing with the canal sediment. They were going to scoop out that sediment, transport it elsewhere, basically take it to a hazardous waste landfill, cap the canal with clean sand, and then harden all of the edges. So even further harden the edges of the canal to prevent any new contaminants from adjacent parcels to come into the system. So it was very complicated, but one of the, and while the EPA has their own way of determining what type of cleanup process they propose for a site, and we didn't really we had no leverage in that particular conversation. That was a thing that was happening and we were all working with it. But one of the interesting things was that we noticed that all of the edges of the Gowanus were becoming harder, but also taller in response to sea level rise. And it just felt like kind of working in opposition to many of the community goals, which was to have spaces that felt more like they referenced those tidal ecosystems, could bring people to the newly cleaned water and have a more like robust and dynamic relationship with the water. So that concern of like watching a lot of the vegetation just slowly disappear along the canal, and a lot of that like unique urban like ecological quality be erased as development occurred, which is just a reality of private landowners, doing what developers do, and the canal being like further bulkheaded and hardened was something that really drove this project. And so through this planning process, we decided to put forward like different alternative visions that would still meet landowner needs and still meet city planning needs, with a couple of different policy tweaks that would allow for edges that could be floodable in some instances, but not allow contaminants to transfer. Edges that could move up and down to have a varied relationship with the canal, not just set really high and you have to like look down at the water like 10 feet below. And then moments where like tidal or future tidal ecosystems could be embedded into the edges in different ways, whether it was through floating wetlands in the future or tidal shelves being built into the bulkhead edges themselves. So we explored these like different strategies, developed a whole toolkit, and this whole toolkit is available on the Gowanus Canal Conservancy's website. You can find their work there, or our collaborative work there. And while we made a lot of like beautiful images that describe these different conditions, like a tidal shelf, a get down, a lowland bank where the pathway is high but the ground below is floodable and could have more of a emergent ecosystem happening. We also developed like very practical tools for landowners to kind of help inform them about the options they had with their bulkhead and what potential elevations they might be able to set their bulkhead at, both to have these more experientially diverse edges, but also still have sites that where the majority of the site, the building, and portions of the primary walkways that people would be using were still lifted out of those zones of future flooding. And so it's been really interesting to kind of watch this project and zoning process evolve. The canal looks totally different today because the rezoning passed a couple of years ago, and due to like a weird fluke of affordable tax credit, housing tax credit expiring, every developer was like, we're building this project right now. And so many projects are under construction right now, and the neighborhood has transformed within a matter of years. So it's a little bit like shocking to go back and visit this space after spending so much time with it being like a low-lying like industrial footprint, and to see like large towers emerging and public spaces being built. But we're working on many different public spaces now for private developer clients. We've kind of transitioned from the working with the nonprofit. We're still working with them. But now we're working for many private landowners, helping like design and actually implement many of these waterfront esplanades, and have been incorporating many of the visions, the visionary ideas of the plan into these more applied projects. So we're actually working to build a public park on top of one of those CSO storage tanks, and this is with the city DEP. So it's a city agency taking on like a really innovative project to have a very hybridized layered landscape where sewage is being stored in large smell-proof containers below a kind of layer of parkland. And in this project, we've been able to introduce a large-scale tidal wetland, one of the first tidal wetlands to be reintroduced back to the canal. Big infrastructure takes a really long time, so this project has a 10-year construction time frame. So we all just have to be patient. But one of the projects that's happened much faster is a project just outside of the rezoning area at Huntington Street. This was interesting because it's a commercial landowner that chose to develop their building in a very modest and small way. And it's not a large residential tower. But what we have done here is try and apply some of these like different concepts, and also we developed kind of like a toolkit, not only of like bulkhead and edge solutions, but a toolkit of paving, of furnishing, of bench elements, of other elements that could repeat throughout different sites to help these sites feel more continuous and stitched together while still having diversity and the kind of a collage type of feeling to them. And so this is the site at 300 Huntington. You can see the neighborhood around has both industrial uses, large-scale transportation uses, new commercial uses to the side. The landscape itself is like a very subtly tiered landscape, with the building being lifted out of the floodplain, and the grove of trees in the foreground also lifted out of the floodplain, but the paths begin to step the closer you get to the canal. And then we have a planted shelf that's built outside of the guardrail. So the project doesn't stop at the guardrail. There's a whole space for plants and for other species outside of the guardrail. At portions it's larger, at portions it's more narrow, and that allows vegetation to spill over the edge and will be like increasingly tidal as every year passes. So it's just some of these like interesting ways that we've been able to kind of implement some of these ideas, even within like the very strong and strict framework of the kind of EPA like hard edge mandate. So there's a lot of stepping, there's a lot of elevation change, and there's a lot of like pockets of more robust ecological life happening within this very small project and a very small footprint, as well as a lot of like very simple project detailing that's trying hard to kind of evoke some of that industrial past. So as the neighborhood gets completely redeveloped, that industrial history is not like totally erased. So this just shows the little scale of this project in relation to like the larger scale of the greater community transformation. Almost every site you can see in that image is going to be redeveloped in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's like quite a wild thing to watch and witness, but I thought like interesting to share with all of you today, because I think it shows how like the seeds of a master plan can really grow and inform spaces over a much longer period of time by engaging many different types of people. I'm going to transition to a second project. This is thinking both about like water and sediment systems at a different scale, also in New York City, but a very different context of Staten Island, which is more kind of open and coastal. The Gowanus is a more inland and protected water system. As Jane mentioned, we had this kind of cool project that was an exhibition project at the Museum of Modern Art called Oystertecture, and this exhibition has sparked a lot of different research ideas that have informed SCAPE projects over time. And Living Breakwaters is probably the most like clear translation of that work into a physical built project. This project was really advanced after Hurricane Sandy through the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government in the States, called HUD. They developed this initiative called Rebuild by Design, where they came to the greater Sandy impacted region in New York and New Jersey and asked different design teams to think about how could we rebuild after Hurricane Sandy in a way that's not just replicating the problems of the past? How can design be part of envisioning a more adaptive and resilient shoreline? And so we were like, oh, we have an idea. We did this like crazy exhibition in many years ago before Sandy about oysters and how they could be a like potential buffer for wave action for hurricanes. And in the resulting years, had actually built a lot more connections and more grounded research on how to make some of those ideas possible. And so we developed a very interdisciplinary team to kind of respond to this competition. And the project was awarded over $60 million for construction and implementation. So I'll talk a little bit about the big picture concepts. The idea was that this was a project that was about risk reduction, helping communities along the coast have less risk from large-scale coastal storms, less property damage, less loss of life. It was also about a culture of resilience, trying to bring people to the water's edge, right? Kind of not think about climate protective solutions being solutions that cut people off from the water, but really solutions that further engage people with the water and help them better understand its potentials and its risks. And it was also about ecology, trying to develop a more robust urban ecology. The project is located in Raritan Bay, this is a kind of geomorphic condition called the New York Bight. It's basically just the way that Long Island and New Jersey kind of come into a point. New York City is right here in the middle, and this is Staten Island. It kind of pushes or funnels storm energy right into Staten Island itself, which is right at the opening of that bight. And that makes Staten Island in particular very vulnerable to wave action over time. And so our team thought about different shallow water ecosystems as potentially being the solution that we could apply. And so we looked for a site within Staten Island that had large expanses of shallow water in which to work. which is definitely not the case all over. I just showed the Gowanus, which has like hard, deep edges. But much of Staten Island had large beaches, which are really important to like the culture of the area. And we thought about how we could develop like a layered approach or layered solution for resilience, not rely on like one singular seawall, but think about how kind of opportunities like a habitat breakwater offshore could help break waves and help build off of other on-land or upland initiatives happening, like the elevation of homes or flood protection within houses. So thinking about this layers and thinking about how an expanded layered system really encourages and invites people to occupy and use the shore in different ways. With shallow, calmer water, more kayaking program could happen out on the beach. More like beach activation could happen. Turned out the community didn't want more people on the beach, but that's not a surprise. So this is like a big image we made for the competition, trying to like articulate this vision of a necklace of breakwaters, of habitat breakwaters or living breakwaters that would help reduce waves along the shore of Staten Island. And wave energy was one of the things that really damaged people's homes and led to loss of life during Hurricane Sandy here, with people's homes being like blown off their foundation because of large waves coming in from the New York Bight. And so this project was not meant to stop the water. This area will still flood, but the water will flood in a safer, slower, and lower way because of the wave buffering abilities of the breakwater system. But they were also meant to be habitat catalyzers, trying to restore some of the habitat of Raritan Bay. And you can see here, one of the techniques we use in this project they're called reef streets and reef fingers. They're these like protrusions of the breakwaters that have a really like subtle gradient of high tide, low tide, like intertidal spaces, kind of going from a higher upland down to like the fully subtidal point, trying to create that real gradient of ecosystems you historically would see within this area. And it was interesting in our conversation with the students this afternoon, we were talking a little bit about like, how do you really dig in and decide, like, you see an image like this and you're like, oh, I see it's like full of life. There's lots of things going on. But how do you design for those specific species or the habitat complex or the food web of species that you're trying to design for? So we met with a lot of different individuals, some people from National Marine Fisheries Services, some local Staten Islander fishermen, which really understood fish ecology in the area. And we learned that fish used Raritan Bay in really interesting ways, especially structure-loving fish, which are fish that would be drawn to elements like breakwaters, also historically drawn to elements like oyster reefs, but the oyster reefs aren't there anymore, but they provided a lot of structure in the water. So like, for example, a finfish is a structure-loving fish. As an adult, it's like out in the large open ocean. And then when it wants to lay eggs and spawn, it moves up the Hudson River, which is this large water body here, and spawns like way upstream, way outside of New York City, way north of it. And the little babies live in the Hudson River for about a year. And then they come out as juveniles or as teenagers and basically hang out in Raritan Bay for another year. So we weren't trying to just design for like all kinds of fish. We were trying to think about, okay, we need to provide this critical habitat for juvenile fish because they are really prone to predation. And historically, these juvenile fish would hide in structured oyster reefs because oysters grow together in these reef systems and they filter the water. They're a keystone species. And one of the reasons they're a keystone species is they provide these little nooks and crannies for fish to hide within so they can protect themselves from larger fish that want to eat them. And Staten Island has lost all of its, or most of its oyster reefs over the past century due to water quality, due to dredging, and due to just like modification, and also due to overharvesting because people just like ate them all. And that like structured habitat isn't really existing in the Raritan Bay any longer. There's lots of big sandy beaches and lots of sandy shallow water habitat, but not structured habitat. So the breakwater provides structured habitat that mimics those historic oyster reefs. And so how do we design that? We thought about like the design of a typical breakwater. Like if you hired an engineer just to design a breakwater, they would likely be like a long line. We thought about like modifying the form to avoid critical habitat within the area. We wouldn't mess up any habitat that was already very functional. And then we worked with marine biologists to modify the form for very localized microscale complexity, which is like the level of complexity that a fish needs, like this scale. we had started off with these like wild breakwater shapes that like wiggled everywhere, and our marine biologists were like, this might as well be a straight line to a juvenile fish. Like, they don't care. They want to see this like really micro scale complexity. And so we changed the whole design to really respond to that. And then we oriented those little reef streets and reef fingers towards the kind of open ocean and the waves. And also thought about like new alternative materials, like an ecological concrete material that could create tide pools and habitat blocks that was designed for the marine environment, but could still perform like a breakwater needed to perform. This work, like this kind of physical project, which is shown here at the bottom of the screen, our concept for it, was also overlaid with concepts of kind of engaging schools at the waterfront and getting people and students involved in this project. So we worked with an organization called the Billion Oyster Project, which is trying to restore oysters to New York Harbor, and had these like different teacher trainings and developed an oyster gardening manual that helped get school groups out to the shoreline to start their own small scale oyster gardens in Raritan Bay that could help build up the baby oysters floating around the bay, looking to kind of attach to a reef system, and also just collect like citizen science data that could help inform the larger scale restoration effort. So that's happening like in parallel to this work. And so what I've showed is just like, oh, I'm so sorry. I also think I'm going over. What I showed is just like a tiny blip on the screen in terms of the timeline. So this was like the project that we showed to the competition committee and was ultimately funded. And we've been working as an office for like a decade now. And the project, we're actually here, we're here finally. The project is fully constructed. The physical framework of the project is fully constructed. So it's a really exciting moment. It's been very long, very complex. And it's also dealt a lot with thinking about like sediment dynamics. So I just put these couple of slides in here to kind of think about, it's not only about breaking the waves, it's also about kind of calming that water and allowing the beach to grow and accumulate really slowly over time. So a lot of research into different engineering conditions and sediment building conditions were explored. A lot of modeling was done. This is like modeling done by our engineering partners. There were like very rudimentary digital models and very sophisticated computational models run on this project, depending upon how it developed. And also physical models, I believe in Ontario, where the breakwaters were built like at a different scale and run through different wave tanks and tests to kind of help verify the digital models. So it was a really long, like very unique design process to be engaged in. A lot of the modeling was so detailed to the point where like little physical replicas of the tide pools we were designing were like built and added to the physical model, and they were like proportionally the right weight in response to the waves that were being sent over them. So it was just this doesn't typically happen in our landscape architectural work, so it's exciting to see. So these are just some images showing the like different like mosaic of materials kind of contributing to this project. Quarried stone, marine mattresses, concrete tide pools, precast ecological concrete armor units that within them actually have core materials for oyster reef restoration. So the idea behind this project is not that it's just mimicking the structure of an oyster reef. We're also trying to actively restore oysters on top of it. And at the same time, it's also an ecological experiment. We're monitoring and studying this project really carefully over time. The location of the tide pool units and the armor units themselves have been arrayed in a way that is statistically like viable to study as an experiment. And so our marine biologists are studying this over time to kind of see how different reef street formations perform. Like, do the ones designed for fish really attract more fish, or are they attracting the same like array of species that the other reef streets are attracting? So it's a very large scale experiment in a way, and we're all really excited about this aspect of the work. And now it is constructed. And so this is a view of one of the kind of reef streets emerging out, looking at the kind of core of the breakwater with the reef streets here and some of the tide pools like in the mid tidal range. It was just completed this winter, and many different species have already been observed using the breakwater, including harbor seals, which I think kind of blew everyone's mind to see the harbor seal using it as a haul out area. Apparently, that's a very happy position for harbor seals. with their little fins down and kind of like kicking up their legs. That's like a I'm good kind of sign. So that's positive. And then at the same time, the footprint of the project is not just located like within the coastal areas. There's also a huge oyster shell recycling program that's going on to collect oyster shell, to cure it for a year so you're not bringing pathogens into the harbor, and then use it to help restore oysters on the breakwaters themselves, as well as like the community outreach and educational outreach that continues to get more like oyster spat or like baby oysters in the water, for lack of a better term. And so I think I'm running over, so I might just close with this series of images so we have time. 5 more minutes? Okay, so I'll show these images, and maybe I'll just like skip ahead and do a kind of quick last project. But this shows the project with the physical form fully constructed. The oyster layer, the restoration, we're doing a layer of live oysters on this project that's happening in subsequent years. So there's still more work to be done here. But the physical structure and form is in place. And just like, seeing the kayak here really gives you a sense of scale of this being, in many ways, like very similar to a traditional large-scale engineering project, but kind of designed and conceived in a totally different way. Continuing to protect the homes behind, build the shoreline of the park out slowly in an ecologically responsible way, and create these like different microhabitat conditions in the harbor. This is looking at it from the shore. And so I'll go through this really quickly. The last project I wanted to share is a project that's also about coastal dynamics and sediment. And it's kind of building off some work that the Dredge Research Collaborative did in California, looking at the greater sediment shed of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers. And it was kind of sparked by a collaborative event that we held. So whenever we feel stuck at SCAPE or even with the DRC, we're like, let's invite in a bunch of collaborators and just talk to them. And the DRC did this with an event called Dredge Fests, where we invited in dredging professionals and ecologists and regulators, people that don't typically get along. But we did a series of like site tours and symposiums, kind of connecting these people in like a safe space to have very open-ended and projective conversations about sediment management. And a Dredge Fest event this is a Dredge Fest Great Lakes event, but a Dredge Fest event in California really sparked a whole design project that I'll show in a minute. And this is some of the research that we did that's embedded within our book about the sediment dynamics of the Sacramento and San Joaquin watershed. What kind of happens here, it's really interesting. This is San Francisco. This is the San Francisco Bay area, and this is the greater sediment shed or watershed. Historically, lots of sediment came and helped kind of nourish and feed wetlands along the San Francisco Bay with hydraulic mining in the basically gold rush and gold mining within the hillsides of California. Even more sediment was pushed down, and that kind of clogged up the delta and created a whole host of issues. And today, because a whole series of dams have been built in this watershed, very little sediment moves from this watershed down to the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's actually starving. It's like sediment starvation, long-term, very slow, kind of invisible crisis of sediment starvation and low sediment supply for Bay Area wetlands. This is just a map kind of showing we've really messed with the sediment system in a lot of different ways. We've made the sediment go really up, and then we've made the sediment go really down. So it's just kind of interesting to map and watch. But a lot of the sediment scarcity in recent years is due to large-scale dam construction in the 1950s, allowing water to move through, but not allowing sediment. So this is a problem in many watersheds across the U.S., and I assume in Canada too, where sediment and water, the flow of sediment water ecologically is united, but we as humans have separated it, right? We've kept the sediment upstream and let the water move downstream. And so it's almost, it's really interesting because the largest input of sediment to the Bay Area today are these very local tributaries that feed the bay. So if the wetlands are really desiring or needing more sediment to be able to keep pace with sea level rise, working locally in the Bay Area is one potential way of handling that challenge. And so SCAPE, as well as the Dredge Research Collaborative and a larger collaborative team, interdisciplinary team, collaborated on a project called Public Sediment, which really tried to think about how to work at this local tributary scale to address the kind of sinking wetlands crisis that the Bay Area has. Because the baylands, the marshes and the mudflats that really help buffer and protect the vulnerable edges of San Francisco Bay Area communities are living infrastructure and should be invested in, just like we invest in roads, we should be investing in our wetlands. And they cushion the urban edges and help mitigate the risks of sea level rise. So, and they're at risk. So one of the things we did as part of this project, this is a more like research-focused project, was look at the baylands and the ecosystems that existed and look at the risks to both human communities, but also ecological communities with sea level rise and a low sediment supply. So these maps show different levels of sea level rise and low sediment supply, and all the kind of pink hatched areas show communities that would be flooded, and all the blue zones show marshes that would be converted to subtidal or deep water areas because there isn't enough sediment coming in to help the wetlands like grow up and keep pace with sea level rise. And so we looked and kind of worked in Alameda Creek. This was like our kind of study area or study watershed or sediment shed for this site. And particularly in the lower creek itself, which had been very dramatically channelized by the Army Corps of Engineers. And that was preventing, the way that channel was designed was preventing sediment flow down the system. And so we developed this whole kind of like campaign around this project about public sediment was about designing with mud and designing with sediment as a design tool, but also kind of making this idea of sediment flows more of a public talking point because it was really impacting people's vulnerability and kind of long-term like safety and health in the Bay Area. And we developed this longer project. If you want to hear more details on it, you can definitely check out our website. We have a whole video that gets into more of the details of the project. But it was a larger like watershed scale project that really focused on the lower tidal and fluvial portions of the creek. We had a piece of the proposal. This is showing the extent of the lower Alameda Creek, this kind of channelized system that moves into tidal bay. This is the fluvial portion of the creek. This is the tidal or freshwater portion of the creek. And this is the tidal portion of the creek. And we thought about how to design a system that could improve sediment flows, engage people, and also we like fish at SCAPE. So we're really focused on steelheads and salmonid species that once used the creek as a migratory corridor, but no longer could because of the way the channel was built. So super high level, a two-part project thinking about how to redesign the actual kind of inner bed system of the interior of the channel and allow vegetation to grow, which is not something they currently allow, to encourage more like meandering, smaller scale, deeper channels that could more carefully mimic natural systems and move sediment during like large scale flood events, as well as provide more consistent, deeper water for fish to use to migrate through the space. And it also was about identifying portions of the channel that could be punctured without increasing the risk of flooding to the greater community, to allow this creek system to connect back to the wetlands which it historically fed, because today they're very disconnected. So this is a much longer, much more complicated project. I don't have time to totally do it justice this evening, but I put it up here to spark anyone's interest in a larger, like more upland approach to climate resilience, because it's not always about exactly what you do at the water's edge. So I think with that, I would love to like take questions. You know, we're on Instagram and all those places, so definitely follow us. You can upload your selfies there, you know, all that stuff. But thank you so much for your time and attention this evening.
Thank you so much, Gena. That was, I think, just incredible. Like this scope from like the baby fish to the watershed is really exciting, and also just, I mean, I was thinking a lot as you were talking about how. And kind of what you ended on, there's something you design, like there's something you put in place, but there's so many other things that are like, it's that you're setting up for, or like unintended consequences, or anyways, it's just, I feel like you gave us such a generous and broad picture, so thanks so much. So we're gonna get right into questions. So who wants to start?
Thanks so much for your talk, Gena. It was really great to see the scope of work and to understand a little bit more of the process that goes into all these projects, especially these ones that are lasting like a decade or more. I'm interested in the background of this, and also something you said earlier in the graduate student discussion, which is that SCAPE is kind of working from a point of meeting the community where there's a certain lack of ecological literacy. And so if we think about just general literacy, which is based on being able to read, being able to write, what would you say are the critical foundations or starting points for building more ecological literacy in citizens as well as designers?
No, that's such a great question, because I think, even within the 3 projects I shared, there's just such a wild range of people's, and even our own, they're super complex urban ecosystems, just a wild range in people's level of understanding about them, right? Someone might be really adept to understanding flooding issues, but then not understand the combined sewage issue in Gowanus, for example, very well. And those 2 things are very related and cause similar impacts and often get blamed for one another. So it's really important to be able to kind of develop tools that help people better understand the systems that have a lot of complexity. And so I think one thing we focus on is, how do we not dilute the complexity of a system in our educational outreach materials, but also how do we not totally overwhelm people with all the granular information? Because it can be really hard. And so a lot of the drawings you saw tonight, many were used in public dialogue, for public education and public engagement. And you probably saw some of the techniques we use are we always present with a lot of images, which is probably overwhelming, but it's because we're trying to isolate different themes and speak to them really clearly and then show how they layer up over time. So the Gowanus slides and images of today's urban context with the historical creek overlaid onto it, that's a really simple drawing, but people always respond really well to that drawing. They really begin to understand how this urban ecology evolved. So I would say that's just one tool that we use as like you said, a building block of building ecological literacy in communities. I think I didn't have time to get super deep into the public sediment project, but one thing we do on many projects, and we did very successfully on that project, was also doing just more in-person events out in the actual landscape that you're talking about, right? So many public meeting forums are held in a school gymnasium, and only certain people can go because they might have childcare, or they can get off at 7 o'clock and show up at a public meeting or have lots of extra time. We try and, sometimes you're required to do those meetings, and those meetings can be very productive, but we also try and do weekend, more family-friendly community engagement that brings more diversity of people and ages together in a more celebratory way. So, you might not even think, we did this event called the Alameda Creek Crawl, which was a series of guided tours along the edges of the creek, but people could come with their families. There were activities for kids. We had trail snacks, and it was really interesting. Many people came and said, this is the first time I've understood that this drainage channel is a creek. Water infrastructure in California is crazy, and this it looks doesn't look like a creek today. It looks like a highly engineered mini version of the LA River or something. But through that interpretive event, people weren't allowed to get to the bottom of the creek, but as part of this tour, the flood control district allowed us to get to the bottom of the creek and kind of show people that there were in fact small fish living in the creek. There were plants starting to emerge. There was a whole different thing happening there that wasn't really able to be interpreted from someone who's just taken a jog along the top edge of a levee or the flood wall. So getting people out and experiencing the ecosystems, often with a local stakeholder or local expert who knows all about the ecological life can be a really wonderful way to kind of build deeper connections with people and help build ecological literacy, but also build like a community vibe and stewardship kind of group around the project.
Thank you.
Hi, Gena. Thanks. I'm making a reference to a course we're taking, Risk and Resilient, Alpha Jersey, on climate adaptation, and she sent us a reading that talks about the idea of fixing a landscape by making it permanently stable, maybe wholly incompatible with a healthy planet. So what's your idea about, having a solution mindset to a problem in a landscape, and, is there usually a solution? Because sometimes you can't predict what happens in nature. How do you combat? What's your approach? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I think I understand at least part of your question. I think I liked your quote that you read about like how do you deal with the dynamic natural systems, and then also I think the desire to have something. We find it all the time for good reason, from politicians, from community groups. You invest millions of dollars in something, you kind of want to see it stick around. It can be very hard to be like, oh, it's going to erode and turn into a large beach. And they're like, oh no, I paid $5 million for that pile of sand. Like, I want to see that every day. So I understand why it happens, but I think it's very politically difficult to implement dynamic projects. And I hope that's something that's changing as a nation in the States, and hopefully Canada too, that there's like a shift in people beginning to understand that to really work with natural systems, you have to be more open to changing dynamic landscapes. And landscapes are going to change whether you think you've built a hard seawall or not. It's just a matter of like how long in the future that change happens and what kind of event or non-event triggers that change. So I like to think of living breakwaters as kind of operating in this like really weird gray territory. Like it's not a project that's about like quote unquote full protection of the waterfront. It's not cutting off water exchange to the beach. It's not preventing flooding in people's homes. It's reducing the intensity of flooding, but it's not preventing it. But it's also not a project that says everyone that lives here has to leave. We're going to relocate. It's not a full retreat project. It's kind of operating in that middle ground. And I find that there's very few examples of projects that are kind of in that middle ground. Like living breakwaters, the beach is going to change over time. The breakwaters reduce waves, whether they're small waves or tall waves or waves that are way bigger than we ever anticipated. They'll still help bring them down a little bit, even if they're not protecting to the degree they protect today with, increased storm intensity over time. So it really is like one of these hybrid in-between projects. It's both a very fixed system, but also participating in a dynamic system. And I think we need more projects like that as precedents. We need to learn from them. We need to build them. We need to like see them work in the world, because the solutions can't just be wall it off or leave, right? Like that doesn't work for so many communities.
I was wondering, like I really enjoy projects that focus on reintroducing local species into like their native habitats. But I was wondering if you guys had run into any issues with like invasive species that I guess their population grows tremendously due to these like improved conditions, and how you guys worked around that.
Yeah, I mean, invasive species like now is just like a fact of life in our work. They're everywhere. We think about invasive species management, not eradication in our projects. There's certain projects at a certain scale. If you have an invasive species, like it is possible to remove all of it. But we're working on a large trail system in the Hudson River, like along the Hudson River, like further north of New York City. And there's not the person power, there's not the funding, there's not even the will or interest from the landowners to like try and remove all of the invasive species that are in that area. Particularly because there's not necessarily good solutions for how to prevent them from coming back, right? You can spend huge resources removing invasive species just to have them pop right up again. And so we think about invasive species management through the lens of management, like where can invasives be more carefully managed, and where is it most important from an ecological perspective to remove them and replace them with something that has better ecosystem impacts, and where is removal not a good use of resources, and might there be ways to like reduce the spread of seed through a management technique of like cutting back seed heads in the fall, and trying to like slowly reduce their populations as opposed to like a large scale, I'm talking about plants here, but like a large scale removal of plants. You know, I mentioned the oyster restoration work, like, you know, it is really interesting to do the oyster restoration work. What typically happens is that like the baby oysters, which are called spat, they're like little free-floating larvae that just kind of float around in the water column. And then when they get to a certain age, like after a couple of weeks, they attach to a surface, and they want to attach to an oyster shell, essentially. They can also attach to concrete and other, they're attracted to things that secrete calcium carbonate, like which oyster shells do. But they attach, and then they start building their little oyster reef. The oyster shell grows, and another one attaches to it, and it just like slowly builds a reef over time. So you need shell as like a core component to restore oysters, because like one of the core ways of restoring oysters is like spat on shell. Like the Billion Oyster Project, our partners on that project, are growing little baby oysters on top of dead oyster shell and putting it in the water. And they're getting that shell from local restaurants. But if you just put that shell directly in the water, you could introduce invasive pathogens to the water. So you have to go through like a very careful process of curing and storing the oyster shell, like for a year or two before it's like brought back into the harbor. So there's a lot of, those are all like management and operational protocols that we do on projects that deal with like species movement and risks of invasion, because it's a really important issue.
Just super quickly, I'm interested in the Dredge Research Collaborative and how you guys have created a space that's, there's not always a funding for things, that the private sector is not interested in certain projects, and there's not necessarily government funding for something, but how you've been able to create space that then can bring those two things together and allow for that. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how it came about and the role you play in it.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I mean, you know, the DRC has been woefully underfunded for like many, many, many years. So a lot of the work that helped catalyze all the different Dredge Fest events and a lot of that early research was funded through like strategic university grants and just like personal time. You know, I ran an internship program and like interns lived in my house. You know, it was a little bit crazy for a couple of years. But you know, as we've all like matured a little bit as professionals and the work has kind of like snowballed a bit, maybe, you know, it's been really interesting. We hosted an event, I think it was like in 2018 or so, with the Army Corps that was called Engineering with Nature. The U.S. Army Corps builds a lot of the coastal infrastructure in the U.S., and they have a program called Engineering with Nature. So it was the Army Corps' Engineering with Nature program and landscape architecture. So where different engineers and landscape architects came together and talked about like, how could we collaborate more? And out of that project came a really unique funding stream that's helped support the organization or the initiatives of the organization. It's not I wish it was organizational funding. It's project funding. But we've been able to do, I think it's like 13 advisory projects over 7 different Army Corps districts, helping the Army Corps identify different projects they have in the works or haven't thought about that could have more like nature-based and socially based missions. And so that's just been like an evolution. We've been around for over a decade. We started in a much more like publication-focused, research-focused, like pro bono, time on the side. A lot of the members of the DRC work in academia, and through academia have some research time and research funding they can put towards the work. And then now we have more of these they're almost like professional projects, right, where we're getting more funding to kind of help advise the Army Corps on some of these efforts. So it's very much an evolution over time. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Gena. So there's an ongoing research in the university-wide about incorporating climate change into the curriculum. And with your experience in practice and approach to climate change, if you could go back to the time when you were in school, what would you look out to be taught to be better positioned to actually tackle climate, what would you recommend for the curriculum?
I would definitely say collaborative design with different disciplines is one of the most important things, because climate cuts across just so many levels, whether it's someone being displaced from their home because of a fire, whether it's like the intricacies of like different kinds of urban flooding and the elevations you have to set things at. It cuts across so many different disciplines. It's just the inherently collaborative practice, and I think that would be one thing I would really encourage you to kind of build your skill set in, is not just how to be like a great architect who can do a great napkin sketch. How can you convey your ideas and change your ideas based on response with like the feedback of other disciplines, policymakers, community members? How do you preserve the seed of something but let it grow and adapt to like all the different external factors that will shape it? So it's very important.
I think that was the perfect question to end on, because I think we're all thinking about that, and your talk has been so inspiring just for us to move forward. Thanks, Gena.
Thank you.